The Ministry of Timelines bears no official responsibility for the content of this research. We record the Commonwealth timeline to have diverged 550 years before the present day. This record has been compiled from contemporary sources extracted directly from the timeline, though it does include some assumptions on the part of the ministry. A history of the British Empire is, at its heart, a history of banking and machinery, and a history that combines most effectively in 1851, when Charles Babbage brings a piece of his analytical engine to the World's Fair at Crystal Palace, using parts scavenged from his now destroyed Difference Engine No. 1. Prince Albert was fascinated with the vision of Charles Babbage, who showed how just one of his analytical engines could work faster and with fewer errors than 100 clerks. But what of the workers the machines would inevitably replace? Well, they would be retrained, says Babbage, promising a return to the factory floor, massively increasing the available labour force of Great Britain. Babbage received royal funding from a greatly impressed Albert. Years of setbacks in accurately manufacturing the analytical engine causes ever higher expenses that risks Prince Albert's continued investment, which both the British government and his wife Queen Victoria explicitly advise against. But the prince is assuaged by Babbage, and Victoria cannot say no to Albert. His patience and investment finally pays off when in 1860 Babbage finally produces a working analytical engine. A second analytical engine was produced just 2 years later for one of the major counting houses in the United Kingdom. Orders from a number of banks at first trickle and then flood in. When the engine's speed and accuracy become known, the increased use of analytical engines exposes the often flimsy, sometimes fraudulent, record-keeping of the banks, a practice that self-corrects within 4 years of the introduction of the engines. And just in time, the large-scale corruption that was rife in the industry was plunging it towards a financial crisis, one which could have had both national and international implications. Across the pond, in the aftermath of the American Civil War, which ended with a victory for the Union in 1867, a general economic boom follows with massive railroad expansion. A boom it may be, but it is not so great as to survive the Chicago Fire of 1871, an outbreak of equine influenza, and the Boston Fire of 1872, and the devaluation of silver in the following year. One crisis after another leads the overextended US banks to their inevitable collapse in 1873. Such was the influence of the American banks that their collapse directly leads to an economic depression across the whole of Europe, except for one country. Only Britain is able to sidestep the panic of 73. The speed at which British banks, or more precisely, their analytical engines, can react to the market is now far in excess of their European or American counterparts. Only too aware of their narrow escape in the international market and understanding how they again were able to stay one step ahead, British banks reinvest their money in more analytical engines, creating an ever wider financial gap between them and their European counterparts. Over the course of the next 15 years, the British are able to buy out their European competitors, installing analytical engines in their new offshore subsidiaries. The British economy naturally booms, and a swelling middle class, bolstered by easy access to cheap loans, puts mounting pressure on the government for electoral reform. Over 2 million men were enfranchised in the Second Reform Act of 1875. But not everyone is happy. In 1877, clerk worker unions organised industrial action to strike against the thinking machines. Police are quick to intervene against these thinkers and suppress fomenting riots and civil disturbances. But they are not quick enough to stop them storming Barings Bank and greatly damaging its analytical engine. Now lacking an analytical engine, and coupled with the inability to move back to conventional clerks, this causes a small run on Barings Bank, as investors desperately try to move their money elsewhere. This crisis in investor confidence quickly spreads to other banks, ironically accelerated by the quick computations of analytical engines, which are not equipped to process such externalities. A financial crisis ensues, and in the aftermath of the Little Recession of 1878, fierce legal protections of analytical engines are put in place by the government, because of the severe impact such actions could have on the nation's economy and stability. Intentionally damaging an analytical engine becomes a capital crime. The 1880s is a period of great economic growth and peace in Europe, with loans across the world being both cheap and easy to access. The burgeoning economy of the German Empire is pushed to the forefront in Europe, whilst the US is only just beginning to recover from the long depression caused by the Panic of 1873. The next great innovation comes in 1889, when John Ambrose Fleming invents the first vacuum tube, a diode. These devices change the face of calculating machines, destined to become a key component of electronic circuits for the rest of the 19th and early 20th century. They will be crucial to the development of radio, television, radar, sound recording, and reproduction. Rising tensions between the major powers of Europe causes a dramatic increase in military spending. Budgets swelled by 50% or more in the period of just a few years, between 1890 and 1893. The main beneficiary is, of course, the British banks, who deal either directly or indirectly with every loan to European governments. 1890. Prince Albert is dead. The country mourns the passing of a titan. 6 months later, a heartbroken Victoria also dies. Their son is crowned Edward VII, King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and Emperor of India. Albert's company, the Royal Computing Company, however, is passed on to his third and favourite son, Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught and Strathearn. As Albert's vast wealth was made from his investment in the analytical machines, this bequeathing makes Prince Arthur as wealthy as his older brother the King, and possibly more powerful. 1894 sees the death of Rudolf, Crown Prince of Austria, assassinated in a minor Balkan nation by disaffected and dispossessed workers, and ignites what will become known as the Great War. A series of treaties come into effect as one nation declares war on the next, and a rapidly escalating nonsense that within a fortnight sees every nation on the continent of Europe in a state of war. The Central Powers of Europe take to the fields to settle the dispute. What was thought would be a quick and decisive war turns into a slow slog through mud and barbed wire. Trench warfare was born, the bastard son of a world that never wanted it. 6 months into the Great War, and Britain manages to maintain its neutrality, while hundreds of thousands of Europeans lie dead in the fields of the four major powers: Germany, France, Russia, and Austria. On one miserable February night, with little to no visibility, a German torpedo boat sinks what they believe is a French vessel carrying materiel to the Russian front. It soon becomes clear that it was in fact the RMS Aquitania en route to St. Petersburg. The British response is swift and decisive. An embargo is placed on the German-Austrian alliance. British troops are deployed to the French and Russian fronts, along with a number of minor fronts opening up across the continent. The giant is entering the playground. The expectation from the British and their new allies is that their presence will bring a swift and decisive end to the conflict. Instead, it is simply more bodies for the meat grinder. In the first year of the British entry to the war, little changes from a military perspective. Rudimentary airships, chemical warfare, and the first land ships do not move the war anywhere near a conclusion. But from an economic perspective, Germany is now utterly crippled. The cessation of British trade means no replacement parts for analytical engines, and banking, finance, and basic functions like a working payroll become impossible. The slow and steady failure of individual engines, each one cannibalized to keep the next running, eventually and inevitably render every device useless, and the information they contain almost impossible to retrieve. The German economy stutters and then dies. A populist revolution topples the Kaiser Wilhelm II, bringing down the German government in a matter of weeks. The new republic, starving and crippled, abandons their Austrian allies and sues for peace. They sign the Treaty of Buckingham, seeing an end to the war but placing the blame heavily on the shoulders of the German people. The humiliated Central Powers are demilitarized and forced to pay massive reparations. By 1897, the Royal Computing Company built their first engine using vacuum tubes, vastly reducing the size of such devices. Once they occupied an entire office space, one machine now takes up the space of a single desk. The reduced size allows for more widespread adoption of analytical engines, and they become used for a much wider variety of tasks and roles outside of finance, from communications to manufacturing. The post-war economy booms. Rampant speculation in the US stock market leads to a titanic crash on September the 23rd, 1907. Black Monday. The effects of the crash ripple out to the markets around the world, and within weeks the world economy, though not as affected as the US, is nevertheless in shambles. Major US banks collapse, threatening further instability. Finally, it all comes to a stop when British banks, who already own most of their European competition, are able to mop up their US competitors for pennies on the dollar. This does nothing to help the millions who are left unemployed, starving, and homeless, both in the United States and beyond. By 1908, Russia also finds itself badly affected by the economic depression afflicting most of the rest of the world. Unrest is felt across all levels of society, directly leading to the assassination of the Russian monarchy. A series of bloody revolutions follow until the Bolsheviks, now known as the Communist Party, are in charge, led by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, otherwise known as Lenin. Unhappy with years of bloated reparations to the Allied powers of the Great War, unemployment continuing to rise, and other factors, Germany begins to sink into fascism. The fall is slow at first, but accelerates by 1916, when the Nazi Party, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, attempts an unlikely coup against the state government of Bavaria. Against all expectations, the Beerhole Putsch, as it becomes known, succeeds. The Nazi Party then marches on the capital of Berlin, where they are met with armed resistance from the federal military. After a few days of fighting, populist uprisings in Berlin and other cities in support of the Nazi march topple the Weimar government. There follows a cessation of civil conflict in Germany. The Nazi Party wins a national election a few months later in a landslide. This legitimizes Hitler's leadership of Germany. International allegations of electoral tampering and bullying at voting places are ignored. German forces reoccupy the demilitarized areas of Germany in 1918, in direct violation of the Treaty of Buckingham. The international community does nothing. Germany unites with Austria-Hungary, their ally in the Great War, in a bloodless coup d'etat backed by what is reported as a legitimate national vote in Austria. The results are not ratified by any outside country, and Germany's records of the vote are unfortunately destroyed in the Great Fire of Vienna some weeks later. International outrage smoulders. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, leader of the People's Union Party, Britain pursues a policy of neutrality and appeasement. 1 year later, Germany annexes Bohemia and Bavaria. Nations around Germany grow nervous and begin a large rearmament campaign. Final preparations of the Picard Line are completed by France on their shared border with Germany. It is a massive line of defensive structures and emplacements designed to deter invasion. Germany invades Poland, a minor state whose independence was guaranteed by Britain, on November 9th, 1921. Britain duly declares war on Germany. France declares war on Germany. Italy abides by their pact and declares war on France and Britain. Russia remains neutral. The Second World War has erupted. German forces overwhelm the Polish defenders in mere days, long before any British reinforcements can arrive. The Picard Line holds the Germans back on the Western Front, forcing a stalemate over the winter. Heavy snowfall and inclement weather delays British deployment to that Western Front. On the other side of the globe, meanwhile, the rising nation of Japan annexes many former colonial territories of the embattled European powers, which allows it to begin a protracted land invasion of China, while using its sea and air forces to attempt to wrest control of the Pacific from the United States of America, a nation still in turmoil and economic depression. After the thick snows clear in the spring of 1922, Germany begins a push through Belgium to circumvent the impregnable Picard Line, catching the French and British allies by surprise. With British forces scattered and under the cover of low clouds, the Germans push through the Ardennes and enter France. Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald resigns under mounting pressure, and is replaced by his bitter rival within the People's Union Party, Arthur Henderson. The Royal Computing Company, in partnership with considerable funding from the Ministry of Defence, makes a breakthrough. They create analytical engine-aided targeting controls and a slew of new weapons including artillery, tanks, Zeppelin-deployed paratroopers and Zeppelin bombers now have pinpoint accuracy. As the weather clears over the Ardennes, and now consolidated in the wake of Germany's blitzkrieg attack through Belgium, British forces bring their new weapons to the battlefield. The use of their modern targeting systems allow the British to blunt the German advance, and within months they force the Germans not only out of Belgium, but back into Germany itself. Russian Premier Lenin listens to the pleas of Germany, who claim to be at war with, and losing to, capitalism itself, which they both understand to be a euphemism for the British. As a result, Russia joins Germany and sends troops to the Western Front. The Russians clearly worried that the capitalists would roll through Germany and then be at their doorstep. While the advanced British weaponry fiercely outclasses their German or Russian counterparts, the Eastern powers have an obvious numerical superiority in terms of troops. The war grinds to a halt with a semi-static front forming along the River Rhine and the Rhineland under British occupation. Japan defeats the United States of America within the Pacific in 1923. They are forced to capitulate, ceding complete control of the Pacific to the Japanese. European powers remain too preoccupied elsewhere to involve themselves in this theatre of conflict. Italy joins the Western powers in 1924, opening a second front in the Italian Alps. Engine-guided British artillery now plays a key part in Western advances on this front. No longer fighting on two fronts, Japan successfully invades Manchuria. With the Russian army vastly depleted and engaged in a slow defeat in Germany, they are not able to mount much of a defense against the Japanese, who quickly fortify their control of the region. Hurting from their defeat in the Pacific Theater, the United States elects an isolationist government, which passes a series of regressive laws banning foreign products and corporations. This has the unfortunate, but probably deliberate, side effect of criminalizing engines. The US economy can only, and does, slip further into depression. Japan and the Western allies of Britain and France then sign a non-aggression pact. This effectively legitimizes Japanese occupations in and around the Pacific. With the fall of Berlin in March of 1925, Germany surrenders to the Western powers. Engine-guided rocketry plays a key role in their defeat. Russia surrenders 6 months later as British boots march on the streets of Moscow. Britain ejects Nazi and communist governments and installs constitutional monarchies headed by minor British royalty, hand-picked as relations of the deposed Tsar and Kaiser to be sympathetic to the overthrown nations, yet staunchly loyal to the Crown of Great Britain. The Second World War is over, at least on the Western Front. Japan continues its occupation of Manchuria, Siberia, and other parts of eastern Russia, alongside their control of China and the Pacific. Primarily acting as a trading bloc, but also with inherent defence agreements, the Greater British Commonwealth is formed in 1927 from the Western Allies, the British Commonwealth, and the puppet governments of Germany and Russia. A revolt on the Arabian Peninsula sees the Arabian government replaced, out of fear of British restitutions, with a pro-Japanese autocracy that joins the new Japanese economic sphere of influence, the Japanese co-prosperity sphere. Oleg Losev, inside Russia, invents the transistor in 1930. The vacuum tube becomes old technology almost overnight. A Japanese ban on the use of engines in 1931 finds an unlikely ally in the United States of America, whose ban on the import of the same devices continues to cause considerable economic troubles. In desperate need of economic assistance, they begrudgingly join the Japanese co-prosperity sphere. The 5 years from 1934 to 1939 sees a period of instability in the East. French Indochina first attempts to defect from the Greater Commonwealth and join the co-prosperity sphere, sparking a bloody civil war. The Philippines then declare independence from the co-prosperity sphere and Japan, which Japan fiercely opposes. Commonwealth special forces are sent to aid the Philippines, a strategy that ultimately fails when the Philippine government is declared illegal and direct control is implemented by Japan. British ships are prevented from reaching Mexico by the United States Navy. The embargo, though, is lifted quickly on orders of the Japanese government in order to ease tension. Fighting in Indochina intensifies as India lurches into a civil war led by Gandhi, in direct opposition to British rule. The nation splits into Pakistan to the west due to the religious intolerance of the new Indian leadership under Gandhi, and India to the east. Pakistan remains a part of the Commonwealth, whilst Japan supports the secessionist Indians. The Royal Computing Company begins manufacturing third-generation analytical engines using advanced Oleg Losev transistors, heralding the production of the first engines small and affordable enough to be installed in people's homes. A member of the British royal family serving in the army is killed in action in India by Japanese forces in 1941. This rocks the British and leads to direct sanctioning of Japan, along with demands that they cease all actions in India and the Greater Commonwealth. Japan responds with a number of embargoes on Commonwealth goods. and a refusal to pull its resources out of the conflict in India. In response, Britain launches surgical strikes, attacks that specifically target Japanese leadership in India, a tactic that both sides had so far refrained from. This escalates again as Japan formally declares war on the British Empire and the Greater Commonwealth. Not all of the co-prosperity sphere follow Japan into the war. The war is greater than all others before it. Front lines include India, Indochina, Eastern Russia, the Indian Ocean, and Oceania. As before, however, superior British weaponry, benefiting from guidance accuracy calculated by engines, allows the British to gain ground and push forwards in the conventional war with Japan. The US officially joins the war in 1942, opening up the Atlantic Ocean as a theatre of war. After what they thought was a minor skirmish against scout ships, the Commonwealth soon learns that they had destroyed the entire fleet of the economically crippled United States. The Atlantic Ocean is open and free, and the Commonwealth launches a naval invasion of the seaboard US, making landfall at New York, Massachusetts, and the District of Columbia, as a prelude to a full continental invasion. The cities on the east coast fall quickly, but the British now face a slow slog across the United States. In the Pacific, the Commonwealth makes similar progress against Japan. Their advantage at sea is somewhat neutralized by the Japanese, however, who appear to have similar guidance capabilities to the Commonwealth's analytical engines, with missile after missile unerringly guided to their target. It is with shock and disgust that the Commonwealth discovers that the Japanese have human pilots in each and every missile, guiding them manually to their deaths. While the cost in lives is heavy for the Japanese Navy, their weapons are almost equivalent to the British counterparts, and the idea of sacrificial pilots contributes to the stall of British naval advances. The east coast of the United States has largely fallen by 1943. British forces in the south reach as far west as the Mississippi River. The cohesion of the United States is also now fracturing, with a number of states surrendering to the encroaching British forces in a bid to prevent further bloodshed and atrocities, as the British employ a new weapon on the battlefield, the attack helicopter. Desperate and losing the war, the United States and Japanese scientists make a breakthrough in the western United States. In 1944, the San Francisco Project conducts their first successful test of an atomic bomb. They quickly build a second bomb, dropping it in Kansas, far away from any cities to limit civilian casualties. This successfully halts the British advance in Kansas. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theatre, the Japanese use a third atomic bomb to obliterate the British fleet based in Hong Kong without a care for the thousands of civilians also killed. Escalation to the sheer destructive power of the atomic bombs shocks the world, and yet the British are unable to agree to peace or even a ceasefire with the Japanese. Any talks are complicated by Japan's public stance, seeing them demand a number of key Commonwealth nations join the co-prosperity sphere, being at odds with their private ones wanting full access to engine technology and schematics. It is a stark contrast to their public vilification of this technology, which they continue to denounce as anti-human. A fourth nuclear weapon is detonated, half a mile above Sydney in the Pacific Theatre, quickly followed by a fifth over the Gulf of Mexico, both attacks designed to knock out infrastructure key to British resupply logistics. The British continue to enjoy a clear tactical advantage on the conventional battlefield, but suffer regular, dramatic, brutal losses when the Japanese and Americans deploy their strategic weapons, their atomic bombs. The sphere is able to build and deploy 10 of their devastating devices over the span of 9 months before the British scientists manage to replicate the science and engineering and create atomic bombs of their own. They immediately deploy it to horrific effect against the Japanese Navy. With both sides wielding the limitless power of the atom, neither side is able to advance, and as the cost of the war mounts, both economically and in the tragic cost of life, the Japanese are finally brought to the negotiation table. An uneasy peace is agreed. Britain agrees to cede Singapore and a number of outposts that were within the co-prosperity sphere, as well as the radioactive swamp that was once Hong Kong. They also allow India to become a neutral nation, with elections to be held under representatives from the Commonwealth and the sphere. Japan divides the United States along what was the front line, to form the Sphere of America to the west and the Commonwealth of America to the east. With an embargo of goods and people from the sphere in effect, a strict proviso is that the border should not be crossed. The Third World War is over. In its place, a Cold War set to span almost 60 years looms uneasily over the prosperity sphere and the Commonwealth. In 1947, Elizabeth, Crown Princess of Britain, marries Alistair Windsor, 2nd Duke of Connaught and Strathern, owner of the Royal Computing Company, and the most powerful man in England, as well as a not-so-distant relation. A mostly political choice of spouse, he is then crowned regent alongside Elizabeth. The Royal Computing Company, or RCC, releases integrated circuit analytical engines in 1950. They are known as the 4th generation engines. The Commonwealth of America still harbours thinker movements, those fundamentally opposed to the use of engines. New York City, 1954, sees a large thinker riot that leads to the destruction of a manufacturing hub for analytical engines. A minor economic downturn is predicted in America, but its effects are limited when further legal protections are proposed. The laws as written protect engines and all stages of their manufacture, while in practice, a special branch of the police is formed, dedicated to the protection of analytical engines, now commonly shortened to simply engines. The National Cybersecurity Center is created. 1957 sees the first satellite successfully launched into space by Japan, followed 2 years later by Japan launching the first man into space. The implication that Japan can now launch human-guided missiles intercontinentally is not lost on the Commonwealth. Britain follows Japan in 1962, sending their first man into space. As much a show of capability as engineering, both sides understanding that engines could be used to pilot rocket craft just as, if not, more efficiently. The space race accelerates the following year as Britain puts the first man on the moon. Japan is unable to match this feat, lacking the engines necessary to calculate the complicated orbital transfer trajectories until 1975, fully 12 years later. By that point, interest in space has greatly diminished, with little economic gain to be found outside of Earth and plenty to be lost in getting there. Similarly, the Japanese economy, without the aid of engines, is driving a large brain drain into the Commonwealth, contributing to their spiralling struggle to keep pace with British advances. British scientist and inventor Tom Berners-Lee proposes a protocol to connect many engines around the world. The Data Railway is born in 1977, a name which is promptly shortened to the Dataway. More and more engines are connected with the protocol, and businesses begin to see the value of communicating not just nationally but globally. The Dataway Bubble begins in 1982, inflating at what looks at first like a steady rate, but is analysed by Tom Berners-Lee as exponential growth. His warnings that this growth is unsustainable go unheeded by more and more entrepreneurs keen to inflate the bubble further for 5 more years, when in 1987 the bubble bursts. Many of the new and overbloated internet corporations fail. The Royal Geographical Society launched their first expedition to the moon in 1990, retracing the steps of the first moon landing 27 years earlier, in 1963. a walking engine, a machine that can walk unaided, is designed and built in 1995. Initial versions are very rudimentary and can only follow simple programming. Beyond research uses, they see only limited use in factory and manufacturing settings. In 2001, after years of economic turmoil and cut off from the world economy without proper engines, a populist uprising takes place in Japan. As a result, the co-prosperity sphere collapses. China regains their independence. The democratic administration of Japan is ousted, and the emperor is returned to their divine seat. The borders of the sphere are opened, and the bloc is dissolved. The emperor agrees to the importing of engines to the sphere. The Cold War ends as quickly as it began, and a golden age of peace, prosperity, and innovation begins, as all major nations are now either satellites to, or simply within, the Greater Commonwealth. The Royal Geographical Society continues their missions to space, launching their first interplanetary expedition, which lands on Mars in 2020. We do this not because it is hard, but because it is interesting, and one does get frightfully bored at times. The first autonomous walking engines are built in 2035, able to replicate both walking and thinking. They quickly replace human workers in both restaurants and menial labour jobs. As other members of the Commonwealth are finally given representation in the British Parliament in 2042, the two-party system finally breaks down. A diverse planet of factions brings a diverse parliamentary democracy to the world. The Royal Geographical Society reaches Venus in 2055. Even with their extraplanetary sojourns, there still exists almost no orbital infrastructure, and there is little competition for space. Only the ultra-rich roam the solar system, sticking flags anywhere they can just to see who gets where first. In 2102, the Royal Geographical Society suffers the first disaster of its kind. In sending an expedition to the moons of Jupiter, all contact is lost, and the expedition never makes it home. The president of the Royal Geographical Society is amongst those lost, and is, incidentally, the Crown Princess of Great Britain, Helen, Princess of Wales, the last of the House of Windsor. The world mourns. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha succeeds the House of Windsor and installs a member of their family as monarch on the British throne. More significantly, the Royal Computing Company passes out of royal control, relegating the new monarchs to a less political and more internationally diplomatic role. 8 years later, in 2110, the Sphere of America formally joins the Commonwealth, uniting with the Commonwealth of America. Elected representatives are sent to the British Parliament, being granted 2 constituencies. The monarchy is finally once more in control of the entire continental United States. God save the King ad infinitum. Autonomous walking engines, or AWEs, gradually become more sophisticated with each iteration of design. And in 2140, they are able to replace all manual labour jobs. Most people find themselves unemployed. In 2158, a satellite array monitoring deep space picks up a signal, clearly of intelligent origin, that nonetheless defies attempts at translation. Spurred on by the signal, Project Blue Hole Punch was initiated 3 years later. Its goal is to create a faster-than-light engine, to let us reach the source of the signal. It takes a long 35 years, but Project Blue Hole Punch is a success. The Royal Geographical Society successfully sends a crewed ship to the edge of the Oort cloud and back roughly 2 light-years distant in a matter of hours. A second-generation interstellar craft is constructed. Designed for a longer-range mission profile, it will take us further, it will take us to the nearest star. The year is 2199. HMS Enterprise is prepared for the first mission to Alpha Centauri and launched. A galaxy awaits. This concludes our analysis of the pre-FTL age for humanity in this timeline. It is clear that the earlier introduction of computer technology led to a significant technological advantage for this civilization when they finally reached the FTL age. Please refer to the next chapter of this report for further details on the Commonwealth timeline.